You're on mute, Jed. Hey, Jed, you're on mute.
Hacker is on.
I'm on mute. All right. Welcome, everybody, to Workbench Wednesday, show number 2. I'm sorry about that. I'm still figuring out this software, I guess. Hey, so tonight we have Bill Logan and David Bush joining us once again, and we're talking everything you want to know about track. And we're going to make this a 2-part show just because there's just way too much to talk about, and it will take all night to do it. And we might have all night, but I got to go to work tomorrow morning. So first, we're going to discuss what we talked about on our last show, which was Soldering 101. And I'm going to show you a quick project that Doug Clark shared with me. I have a little movie here, and we'll play this. So he's got an egg liner that he put the EOT on the back of. And in a second here, you'll see the inside of it where he soldered everything up. But this is it's the exact same setup that I had, same project, bought from the same guy. And a little switch on the bottom so you can turn it on and off. And it's just a nice little detail you can add to your train. So David, I know you were working on buying a soldering iron this week. Did you have any luck with that?
I did, yeah. Yep. So I took everything I learned from our first show, and I went to ESCO, which, if you're in Columbus, Ohio, it's in Clintonville on Indianola. But I did purchase a soldering iron there. Sadly to say, this is the first day I've taken it out of the box. It came with a holder and some stuff here to clean your soldering iron. We talked a lot about price last week, and when I went into ESCO to take a look, they had about 8 of them on display, and they ranged anywhere between $20 to $80. The one I got, it's probably more than I'll probably need, but it was $70. I got it because it has a digital display. As Bill was telling us last week, it's important to know the temperature of your soldering iron. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to use it. It's on my list of things to do. But part of the reason I haven't been able to use it is because, Jed, as you mentioned in that first episode, I got a nail gun, air compressor nail gun as well. So, I just want to show you something I've been working on. As you know, I'm expanding my track to a double loop instead of just one small loop. And I've been working on a tunnel portal, and that's what came out of it. So not bad for my first attempt. I'm not very savvy when it comes to mechanical things. So
it looks fantastic.
Yeah, that's probably good lighting. But yeah, it's definitely exciting. Ready for some warm weather so I can get out there and start, plugging around a little bit more. But that's what I've been up to.
Yeah. Oh, very good. Well, we've had snow this past week, and so at the end of the show tonight, we have some snowplow footage from Tim Dove, and stick around for that. It's some really nice stuff. So I think, Bill, do you have anything to comment on our soldering work from last week? Anything that you want to talk about?
It all works. The only point is to recall that the solder wants to be a rosin flux solder, and typically you can get it at ESCO too, by the way.
Yeah.
The typical solder that you get in Home Depot, Lowe's is for plumbing, and that is a acid core. Do not use acid core. It will literally eat the electrical connection up over time. So
I better double check.
The name of the game is rosin core. It should be written right on the container for the solder. And most of the electrical solders too are smaller in diameter, so they're easier to deal with, and you don't get as much material on your connections.
Yeah. And I also got the advice sent over to practice. Don't start on your good stuff first. Practice on just some old wire, and
always start with a clean soldering iron
that too
been cleared of old solder.
Yeah.
Always helpful.
Yeah, I'm fortunate. I have a older brother who he got all the functional mechanical skills. So he's been soldering for a while. So I'm going to get with him, and I showed him my setup, and compared to his, it looked like a toy. So I think I'm in good hands. So hopefully get some time with him and get some things soldered. So
Yeah,
I'll keep you updated.
great. So moving into our main topic tonight, we're going to discuss track, and we have a whole timeline here of that Bill put together for us. We're going to make this a two-part show. There's just way too much to discuss in one episode. And what I'll also do, I'll go through later and put in the show notes timestamps for different topics that we discuss. So if anyone who's watching this in the future, not live, they can just fast forward to different things we're talking about right away. So to bring in Bill Logan here, he's having had some maybe difficulties with cameras and things. So this afternoon he called me up and said, "Hey, I'm coming over to your house to the film tonight." So I had about an hour to rush around and set everything up, and we added a bench cam here that Bill is working off of, and Bill's about 15 feet away on the other side of the room for me. So if you see me looking up over at Bill, "Hey, Bill, how you doing?" he's just over there. So Bill, I am going to hand the show over to you and let you discuss track. And if anyone has any questions, please put them in the comment area, and I'll pop them up on screen, and we'll do our best to answer. Also, if you're new to our show, I'll also please ask that you subscribe to our channel so you get notification about future shows. So with that, Bill, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jed. I assume I'm unmuted and ready to roll here.
Yep.
Okay, well, where do you start with track basics? Well, at this time of year, you start with a starter set, pretty much. Christmas is over. Hopefully, all those interested have obtained a starter set. If not this year, you've already had one. And wanted to briefly point out in the back of me here, the starter set we have is pretty typical of all those that are on the market, consisting of a engine, a few cars, power transformer, sometimes a separate controller, sometimes they're integrated, a wire connection for the track to go from the low voltage transformer to the track. And last but not least, actually one of the most important things is the track itself. Most all of the major manufacturers provide a starter set, a circle of track, just that, a circle for the most part. And more often than not, it's a 2-foot radius, 4-foot diameter circle. And therefore, there's 12 pieces of track in them. And these are all sectional, already made, ready to go. All you got to do is take them out of the box, start the process of assembling them one at a time into what ultimately will be a 4-foot diameter circle by using what we call the sliders that connect the pieces together. And by the time you're done, you're off and running, connecting the wire to the transformer, putting the train on the track, and away you go. These are called starter sets in part because they're only intended to get you started, meaning that you get a circle of track and you can run a train around and around all the time you care to in a circle. Most of us tire about that somewhat quickly and want to expand our trains, and therefore we get into, first off, dealing with the track, and that's what tonight's topic is all about. As you can see on the table before me here, the table is replete with all sorts of tracks, so don't let it scare you. We'll see how we can go with that. The starter sets, typically people start indoors in the house, but quickly find, as the hobby implies, it's garden railroading, therefore you want to take it outdoors. And as soon as you take this bright, shiny brass track outdoors, after a week or two, if you leave it outside with the idea of running your trains outdoors, the first thing you're going to encounter is all that bright, shiny brass in no time flat turns to an oxidized color. We'll see if that's going to work out there. Yeah, everything oxidizes. As soon as that oxidation occurs, and then the trains don't run, both in terms of the rail and as well as the connectors. So part of this effort tonight is to give you some guidance on how to address that issue, what to do, as well as what to purchase to minimize that problem as time goes on. So once you set your track out, it'll stay workable for you in the long run. A real quick comment. Well, what does the track do? It seemed like it would be a very basic issue, but it obviously, its primary function is to guide the train along a predetermined path, complements of the flanges on the wheel and the height of the rail. It provides a somewhat scale appearance, although most of the track is relatively large in format, not necessarily prototype. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It provides a continuous electrical path, and probably in the big picture of things, that's the most important thing to keep in mind. When it's all said and done, whatever you do, you have to maintain continuity along the entire track length. And the major issue there is how you connect these tracks together as a result. As far as the track being able to carry power, this large rail you see is so large, it's like a number 6 copper wire. It has very little voltage drop in its own right. You could put literally 1,000 feet of this out in your yard, and it will do fine carrying power to the train, except where the individual pieces come together, and that tends to be the downfall of the process. And therefore, we'll give you some guidance on how to minimize the problem with voltage drop complements of bad connections. Okay. The one other point I wanted to make as we start out here, this hobby, unlike maybe some of the other scales, is a bit unique in that all the manufacturers, all the track is all the same gauge, 45 millimeter between the rails, or 1 3/4 inches if you're into the English system. But it, in this hobby, carries 6 different scales of equipment, all the way from 132, which actually represents standard gauge railroading, all the way up to now 7/8 inch scale, which is the track represents 2-foot gauge to that size of equipment. Most of us these days are running 1 to 20. This starter set back here is a proportion 1 to 22, the real size, and typically represents close to 3-foot gauge here, as we experience it here in this country, or 45 millimeter or I don't want to say 45 millimeter in Europe, but it's their equivalent to 3-foot gauge. So most of our equipment tends to represent narrow gauge equipment, but you can, with a reduction in scale down to 1/29 or 1/32, represent standard gauge equipment. But the track doesn't change. It stays that same distance apart. And that's the thing to keep in mind. So you could literally change scales of equipment over time and not have to change any of the track, which is a good thing, I suppose.
It gives you lots of options.
Lots of options as time goes on. I know myself, I started in the middle of the road, 1 to 22.5. Found I wanted to run some standard gauge equipment, so I dropped down to 1 to 29 in some cases. And then ultimately I've gotten enamored over time with the live steam end of it, and the 7/8 inch scale is where I'm currently experimenting with.
Yeah, well, I've seen live steam trains that don't really follow typical, 1 to 22 size. It's much larger and a little more whimsical maybe looking, but if it can fit your wheel sets on them,
as long as it runs on the track, you can be marginally pretty decently happy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Bill.
Typically out there, 4 major manufacturers. And with regard to track, and we'll try to keep the topic on the track.
Dave,
tonight.
did you have a question?
Yeah, Bill, I was just going to interject real quick. So for those that didn't see the first episode, I just started garden railroading in July. And Bill, everything that you hit on as far as like different gauges, it confused me because I passed up opportunities to get used track, because it was oxidized, like you had pointed out, and it didn't look shiny like my track from the Pico starter set that I got. So I passed up on that track. Then, you hear about the different sizes. And what I didn't know at that time is, they all run on the same track, which is important. So, again, I know we have some new viewers or people new to G Scale. So just to reiterate, what Bill had said, your trains will run on that track. So
as long as it's between the rails running the same, all the equipment will run on it.
right.
I'm going to claim there's 4 major manufacturers. May get a little grief from some of the manufacturers out there, but in alphabetical order, Bachmann, and I have a piece of their track here. Now, these are the ones that come with the starter sets, not the ones that you can buy in aftermarket issues. And I'll point out an item right off with regard to the Bachmann. The Bachmann, in order to keep the cost of their starter sets low, use what we consider template track, just like the Lionel O-gauge stuff. The caution right off the bat, therefore, and if I hold this up, maybe we can see that just on the end. You'll see the track is not solid. Is actually open-ended, just like template track is, and it's not solid material. I'll leave the point. The fact is, it's tin. It's plated tin, and it will rust over time. I'm sorry, it's tin plated steel, and it will rust over time. Don't recommend taking this outdoors. Just keep it as a starter set indoors around the tree, whatever. Okay. We have USA trains, their brass track, their plastic ties, a little bit different rail clamps. We'll talk about those tonight. We have LGB, a slightly different spacing on their ties, a little bit different look, but similarly in smaller, narrow gauge look. And then this one here is from Pico. I don't have the, well, we'll use this one. This is Pico's. It has the same standard sliders on the ends of the track. Similar in terms of the tie simulation, and again the rail. We'll get into the code size and all that here in a minute. Why is the rail the size it is? Well, because they also chose to provide flanges on all the trains that are way oversized from prototype in order to keep the equipment on the rails as you enjoy the hobby. If they were prototypical scale, it would drive you crazy outdoors. Odds are you'd spend all your time with derailments. Okay. We'll move on from that one. Typically, as I said, the starter sets come therefore with a 2-foot radius of track. Each track section is approximately 1 foot in diameter. The rail is the size of it. The profile, if you will, is what they refer to as 3/32 of an inch. It's brass typically. It has plastic narrow gauge ties, and the ties typically in the starter sets represent narrow gauge, not standard gauge. And they all typically come with what we call slider rail joiners.
We'll be talking about other rail joiners in aftermarket ones here in a little bit. So hold your horses, everyone. We'll get to rail joiners.
So the first thing you do after you get past your starter set size is say, well, wait a minute, I want to go outside. And the next thing is, I don't want to have to put together 1 foot lengths of track. Well, fortunately, the manufacturers thought about that. And not only do they offer 1 foot pieces, but they also offer 2 foot, 4 foot prefabricated sectional tracks. And a few of them actually even got a little bit longer. But for all intents and purposes, those are the major, most of the manufacturers stuck within those dimensions, if only because just the shipping and the storage and the sales limited that to those kinds of sizes.
Yeah. Now, Tim Dove mentioned here about Aristocraft used rail. Are there other brands that you would steer towards or steer away from buying used? Or you don't want to comment?
No, that's fine. I'll always comment. What's available out there in the used market is all going to be oxidized. Okay, and that's our next clinic, our track 102.
102, yeah.
How do you clean it or refurbish it? We'll leave that for later. We're assuming you're getting the stuff out of the boxes and starting right away with clean material.
Brand new track, yeah.
Because there's a whole section on how to re-clean the track and go with it. But here's a piece that you brought up earlier. Okay, this is a piece of flex rail, which we and some ties that are pretty well oxidized and need a good cleaning, and all that's quite easy. It can be done. The main thing is to make sure that it's the same size, the 3/32 of an inch, and that the ties are not so degraded from sun and UV that the rails will not any longer stay in the edge.
Right. Yeah, because when those
a lot of times when people take this stuff up, they just sort of rip it, and the rail gets twisted, and it pops out of the guides, which are meant to simulate spikes and tie plates. Hopefully that helps. So don't let it discourage you. Obviously, you'll get a considerably discounted price out there on all that material. You'll probably have to expend in man hours, time differential, if you had to pay yourself in cleaning the stuff up to make it workable, but it's all feasible. And hey, it's a hobby after all, right?
That's right.
Okay.
We're not here to make money.
Hey, Bill, quick question. Hey, on that track, when you buy, so I know you were talking about it comes in standard pieces up to 2, 3, 4, or 5 foot. Do the different brands, like the straight pieces, come in different lengths? I could have sworn I was at the train station on Indianola, and they were showing like LGB next to Pico, next to like another brand. And I think the standard straight pieces, are they different lengths or?
Well, of course they are.
Okay.
By a little bit, but once you take a little bit and multiply it by 50 little bits, you get a big difference.
Okay.
There's ways to make up differences. If your intent is to take a piece of track out and put an alternative manufacturers in, be ye forewarned, there is dimensional differences in the length we're talking about, not the gauge. The gauge is still good, but the lengths do vary. And particularly then when you get into the radiuses, there is distinctions between the radiuses on the prefabricated stuff. That's just the way the hobby has evolved over time.
Yeah, comment just threw up on screen. Andrew says you can buy replacement ties. RLD sells them. And yeah, that's always an option when you buy used track, is buying new ties kind of freshens things up.
Yeah, and again, if you can, these are meant to, they're flexible. If you push in and pull and tug around, if there's just a little bit of give to them, it indicates that the UV light hasn't baked them out.
Baked them, yeah.
And you should be in decent shape with them. Well, if you pull a rail in or out, you should be able to do just that. If it doesn't work that way, then yeah, I'd steer clear and go in a different direction on it, because it's just at that point it just becomes a whole pile of unusable stuff.
And I'll mention one mistake I made when I was just getting in the hobby. I bought a lot of 1 foot sections, not knowing that you could buy 6 or 8 foot long sections. And boy, was that a mistake early on that I made. So just everyone know, you can buy long sections of track. You don't have to use the 1 foot starter sections.
Well, there we go. That brings us to my next topic, the flexible track. Okay. Most of the manufacturers stopped, as I say, at 4 foot on the prefabricated fixed track that is stable. Once you get beyond that, then you get into what we refer to as flexible track. And that allows a whole lot of flexibility. No, I guess a pun intended on that one. It allows custom radiuses at your discretion. It provides flowing curves. With regard to you minimize the number of rail joints, which is critical. We'll get to that a little bit more later. And even though there's some assembly required, none of this in the flexible rail. I'm going to show you. Here's a piece of 6 foot high. I'm not going to stand up. I'm a little bit less than 6 foot high. these days. But yeah, let's see where we at. We're up here at our camera here. No, we're in front.
Yeah, we're
So
in the
we're going to
front.
start, and take my word for it. There's a 6-foot piece of flexible track. Now, again, you don't buy it this way. What you do, it comes with the tie sections in roughly 1 foot increments in a box, and the rails are separate in another box. Actually, it's a tube. And you get the enjoyment and fun of
Threading all those
assembling
on.
it on site or in the basement, wherever the case may be. And in fact, I won't even do that here with our time issues. But you can now. This is a piece of this rail here is aluminum. It's 332 aluminum on plastic ties. The ties, in fact, in this case, are LGB ties. You can once again mix manufacturers on the ties because again, the gauge is the same.
Yeah.
But it is flexible, and I brought this aluminum one here because I don't have to use a rail bender on it, but you can see how it flexes. And you can, once you bend it to a point, it will stay where you want it to.
Now, you should have said that was stainless steel. Everybody would
No,
be impressed.
sorry. If this was stainless steel, I would not be able to bend it.
So, Bill, just to interject again real quick, so being new, again, looking at used equipment, I have shied away because people would just have those long, like the rail parts, and they're all like bound together. And I didn't know what to do with them. But like you had just shown, you can get the plastic, like railroad ties that just slide right on it. So I still haven't ventured that way because, the bending of the rail and the rail bender, which you'll talk about here shortly, is kind of I guess I just haven't needed to, and it's kind of intimidating, from the outside.
I mean, if you're starting out, I really do highly recommend you start out with newer materials because you'll quickly get frustrated with used track because it is typically bent. Most of it's not straight in the scheme of things and has the oxidation problem associated with it. I did want to comment before we moved on too far beyond the tie issue. Here is an example of a product from a company called Sunset Valley. Once again, the scale, the gauge, if you will, is identical. However, this is more prototypical rail and ties, both in standard gauge as well as narrow gauge. And in addition, just to confuse you a little more, there's all 4 types of rails type materials that you can purchase out there. There's what we've already talked about, the brass. There's already the aluminum we've commented on, but then there is also the stainless steel here. And a product I haven't mentioned, but now I will, is nickel silver. Okay. Nickel silver is available. Most of it is available in the more prototypical size. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, why don't I just go out and get the prototypical scale rail? Well, along with the prototypical scale rail and ties comes one of the problems that you quickly run into with your starter set equipment is that the flanges start hitting the simulated tie plates and spikes, and more often than not at the switches, which is another topic for next time. Obviously, the flanges of our equipment are not in scale, as I've already commented on. Not that they have to be this large; they can be slightly smaller and fit the rail, but it does force you into changing your wheels out too. So be forewarned on that. Not so much I'm going to say not a yeoman's problem on the actual equipment like the box cars and cabooses, but it's a killer on the engines. And most likely on the engines, you actually physically have to turn down the flanges. Yeah. If you really want to get bogged down quickly, that's the way to do it.
Yeah. Move the mic a little bit closer to you. We're
doing
a comment or two that it's
okay.
Okay. Awesome. Just a little bit, yeah.
There we go.
Hey, Bill, and just because I don't want to take anything for granted as we're watching this, when you talk about the flange, I assume you're talking about the flat part of the wheel that keeps it on the track, right?
This little, you got the wheel itself, and then you have the flange at the edge of the wheel.
Good.
That in its own right winds up being this is what keeps the trains on the track, that little flange.
Yeah.
by riding the rail. And as you can see, as soon as you start getting this smaller rail, and by the way, this is not the smallest rail in this in G scale that's available out there. In fact, let me just make the comment on that real quick then. So we've already talked about what comes in the starter sets, 3 32nd, and what that represents is 3 32nds of an inch. So it's basically 1/3 of an inch in terms of total height. The next size down is what you see here, which is 250 code rail, and therefore it's 250 inch, or if you will, 1/4 of an inch high. And comparing the two, you can begin to see the slight differences between the two. And last but not least, I brought one lonely piece tonight, but it's so blue and small. Oh, there is 215 rail, which is this stuff here. And this is prototype. This would go to prototype, be typical narrow gauge, 50-pound rail kind of stuff. And if you want to redo all your flanges, this is the rail that you can deal with if you choose to. But again, this is track 101, so we're going to move on from that.
Right.
I just want people to know that.
You wouldn't find that for sale.
I would not
in most
recommend that for
places.
first-time outers, and you got to be really devoted to the prototype component of the process.
The flanges would hit the ties, and it would look like your car was going over speed bumps constantly.
Yeah, well, and they simply will. I can guarantee at the switches they'll do rail.
Sure.
Okay.
I can do that with regular track.
So we've talked about the material types available out there. We've also commented about the difference between narrow and standard gauge. And
Hey, Bill, just to kind of close the loop on that. So as a new person, if I have a starter set and I just go into your typical hobby shop, you covered a lot of different options, but in general, your Pico track, your LGB, your other track that they offer in hobby shops, all of those will work together just fine, right?
yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, so put me to the test here, right? Okay, USA trains, Pico trains, LGB stuff. Other than the slight variation in there we go. There's our 2 straight pieces. Thank you.
Perfect.
All works together, all looks the same up to a point. This brass is a little shinier than this brass. These ties are slightly different looking than those.
Yeah.
The sharp-eyed person might be able to detect the difference, but all said and done, it still lets the trains run, okay?
Yeah, I work with having one type of track going into a tunnel and a different type going out of the tunnel. So, you don't see
by the way, we're also fortunate all the manufacturers were kind enough in the plastic imprinting process of their ties. If you look there, well, it's going to be a little tough, but if you look in there, you'll see the Lehman name. Here, you'll see the Pico name inside their ties. So that would, if you're going to go out and look at or consider some used product, that'll be the way that you can predetermine what manufacturer product came from. Very seldom, unless it's in the big flex track. Again, the plastic ties and the rail issue. That's not track 101. That's track 301.
Yeah.
And the issues.
Not quite graduate level, but
All right. Well, we've almost really dealt with the 2 cautions I'll make with regard to the rail and therefore the code. One of the great advantages to being thicker, by the way, is, and I know LGB was one who touted this particularly, but people would run this stuff across their driveway to get from one side of the driveway to the other, and you could literally run your automobile over it, and it remains and then move a little bit if you don't tie it down. But it is so stable and it's so tough to put up with that kind of abuse that it'll stay there. Once you get away from this big heavy rail, then issues do begin to rise. Once you get into the smaller rail, for example, this is the 250 rail I mentioned. The one problem there is you can't step on this. So if you come out in your railroad and do we're not going to deal with road beds tonight, but if you do put gravel roadbed in and you and unfortunately, therefore your track is usually the only real clean path you've got to go from one location to another. And you step on this stuff, odds are you're going to bend the rail.
Yeah. Done it. Been there.
Bent the rail. This stuff here is really bulletproof. I mean, it's really hard pressed to screw it up. Yeah. Whereas, and then you can well imagine if this becomes a problem, when you get into that 215 rail, that problem is compounded even far more so.
Yeah.
So be forewarned. But there are some folks out there that really want to be scale
I did
aficionados.
I saw another question here. We can bring answers. What are the kind of roughly the cost per foot for different kinds of track? New. Let's go with new prices.
New. Well, you roughly should ask. Okay. The basic rules of thumb are: the harder the metal, and for those of you, we've talked, aluminum is the softest and most malleable. The brass is next up the line. The nickel silver is in between, and last but not least is the stainless steel. Okay. And I mentioned those in that order because that's literally how they cost out. You can get prefabricated sectional track in either the brass or the stainless steel. Aristocraft was well known for producing stainless steel 3/32 rail, and it was beyond bulletproof. It's much harder to work with, and did an excellent job of putting up with the weather. Why would you consider stainless steel over brass? Well, the one nasty problem that we started this point out with, that oxidation that kills you on the electrical conductivity, is very, very minimized with stainless steel. Not to say that it won't over a long period of time oxidize, but you'll be able to retain running a lot longer with stainless steel.
Yeah.
And the stainless steel has the white, shinier look to it, similar to real rail than the brass does.
Yep.
But it is what it is. So what we're saying in terms of bucks, if you want to consider it that, a 1 foot piece of sectional track is typically running $6.50. Now that's both rails and ties and the joiners on it. When you cost them out, $6.50 a foot. So if you want to have a 100-foot railroad, you can do the math on that. It starts adding up rather quickly. Whereas if you go to the stainless steel, in the same gauge, same everything, the track looks identical. That $6.50 jumps up to $10.50. And the other two types, aluminum is the least expensive, and probably is actually the aluminum track is closer to $3. I don't know of anybody of major manufacturers though that produce aluminum sectional track. Once you get in the aluminum, you're into the custom, flexible, do it on your own business there. Okay, but it is less costly. But I'll caution you on the aluminum track will not conduct electricity after the first week. And you simply don't want to use it for your electrically powered trains. It's just not worth it. If you're running live steam, if you're running battery only, go for it.
Yeah.
Have at it. You can do it that way. But it does limit you when you want to look at electrically or
DC
motor powered equipment. Okay.
Thanks.
That does get us into the ties on my listing here. So let's touch base with those just a little bit. Tie materials typically tend to be of two versions. One, in the case like of LGB and Pico, they use a product called Norel, which is a fancy name for plastic track. And others tended to use a high HDPE, high density polyethylene, both of which then the whole chemistry business comes into play, because if you don't want the ties to brittle out, if you don't want the light to change the color of the ties, then they had to use UV additives as well as other materials. That's a discussion for BASF. But obviously over time, you still want the ties to be flexible, and you still want them to try to retain their original color up to a point. And those two issues play a dominant role in most all of the track you can get, in terms of particularly the ties being prefabricated. There are modelers out there that want to use real wood ties, and if you do, then both cedar as well as, I'll say, treated wood, pine treated wood, whatever, is the way to go. But I've been there and done that. There's a lot of issues there with degradation over time.
Yeah, I'm sure the first year looks good. Next year
looks a little ragged, and that once the tie plates and the spikes on wood ties start dying, then you're toast because you lose your gauge.
Right. Yeah, they start spreading apart and cars go flying.
This stuff, the plastic stuff's really been bulletproof. I've had my track out at my railroad since 1991.
Right.
So you can do the math on that. I'm pushing 30, coming up on 30 years this next year. And it still works, and I can still step on it because I chose to use the heavy stuff and stick with the brass. Okay. The plastic, the only other comment I'll make is the plastic is therefore susceptible to snow and rain, and maybe more importantly, depending on what part of the country you're in, cold and hot. Even in our area, I mean, we have 10 at times, occasionally 10 degree, I wouldn't say down to zero. And in the summertime, over 90, pushing 100. Well, that's almost 100-degree swing.
Yeah.
And both the ties and the rail do expand and contract. And maybe I'll make that comment with regard to our aluminum discussion, brass and stainless. The stainless rail expands half the distance that the brass does. And the aluminum rail, I'm going to reverse things. The aluminum rail expands twice as much as the brass does. In point, if you have 8 feet of aluminum rail, it'll move approximately 1/8 of an inch along its length. The brass rail will be obviously half that, and the stainless will be almost negligible.
Yeah,
in the scheme of things. So something to account for there too.
Yeah, I've seen aftermarket heat and shrinkage gap. I don't know what's the official word for those. I think Split Jaw made some for a while. That
expansion contraction.
Yes.
All the stuff does move. Some of it's just the natural business of shifting. Again, expansion, it isn't as much at times the rail moving physically as the roadbed and the gravel and the ballast underneath it and the dirt and everything else moving it. And therefore, how it tends to shift out of
Yeah, I know from experience on my railroad, if I run it all day in regular heat of the summer, as soon as it gets to be maybe around 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, it will start to derail once in a while. I think that's just from expansion and contractions, and by the time that nighttime comes across, things have moved a little bit, and now it won't derail all day long until
only a certain time.
Only at night it wants to start to derail at times.
I did want to make a comment, and particularly this is in reference to the flexible track. But once you get out of the standard radius and then you're going to get into the business of bending rail. Okay. And what I have in front of me is literally my rail bender. It looks dirty because it's had many thousands of feet of rail bent through it. Here's our 332 rail, brass, no drill. Just the kind of radius you want with this, and fit it in, and then proceed to, manually, ladies and gentlemen. At least that's the way I've been always doing it. Running it back and forth to even out the bend. And once that bend's in it, then the rail stays bent that way. Now, this is very subtle in terms of what we're dealing with here today. In fact, but I wanted to make that point. And there's also rail benders out, and I'll get back to CGRS in this case. Our club has a dual rail bender, both rails simultaneously, and while they're already fixed on the ties.
Yeah.
Whereas this requires you to bend the rail independently and then string the ties through them. Sounds rather arduous. It's 6 of one, half dozen another up to a point.
Yeah, I've heard arguments both ways, and I think there's probably a situation for using both kinds of rail benders.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, I'd be interested in your thoughts. So when I first got my Pico starter set, as you said earlier, it comes in a circle. So of course you need to expand it immediately. And, I bought some Pico, 4-foot sections. So now I have an oval. And, it's nice and shiny brass. And I thought, hey, when this goes outside, all I want is Pico track because I want the same look. I want the same railroad ties. But as, used track has become available, I've got track from different, brands or companies. So my railroad ties on the tracks are different sizes. They look a little different. I thought it would bother me, but it doesn't, especially after you get it and you get, your road bed on top of it. You have rocks on it. You have different things around it. On your railroad track in your garden, do you have all of the same railroad ties, or do you have a mix?
I was fortunate to keep because my railroad, I did not use any sectional track. I went all flex track, even for the straights, which I've done. Um, Therefore, it's remained consistent. Now, I've built railroads for other people that or added extensions onto it that we've either chosen or had by necessity the need to change track manufacturers due to availability. And what we've found and what we've done on a few if things look really out of sorts. I know Aristocrat tended to over time their tie materials for their standard gauge product. Well, both standard and narrow gauge was black, not the brown that you see here.
Right, right.
And therefore there was that intermix. And we simply solved the problem by going out and running taping the rails with painter's tape and proceeding to use spray paint uh, and spraying the top of the ties to blend the two systems together. Now, the fact of the matter is, over time, by the time Mother Nature gets done with the rails and you have ballast in between the ties, all said and done, that difference becomes almost negligible.
Right.
It tends to go away, and I don't see it as a major issue over
Good.
time. So keep in mind that nice shiny track is all going to get dirty in short order. Okay, Mother Nature will force that on you whether you like it or not, as
Yeah.
well as your neighborhood birds, squirrels, and chipmunks.
Yeah.
In the scheme of things, uh, wanted to get to the most important issue that I consider when it comes to rail, be it either flex and or certainly the sectional, and most maybe moreover the sectional because of individual smaller parts is how you couple the things together. Now, we already talked the business of what comes with your starter set are what we call slider rail joints. They slide in on the rail on both sides. No big deal. Well, we don't have to do that. We can prove the point, but you can begin to see the
Yeah.
standard uh, slider type rail joint. You can purchase these independently. Now, the one advantage they have, and this will come up to be a point in in a few minutes. They actually have a little tab inside that grabs the first tie. And every manufacturer did it this way. There's actually a little down piece of metal that grabs onto the tie. And what that does for it is it locks the rail in place on the tie sets. The ties are all connected together behind themselves. You can't see it because it's under the rail. But the rail joint actually also functions to keep the rail in place. Otherwise, and I'll use my other piece here. Okay, here's a section of 1-foot track that we've taken the rails, the slip joint rail joints off of, and we've started the process of putting rail clamps on. Well, you can see right off the bat that although the rail clamp stops the rail from moving one direction, it doesn't keep it from moving the other direction in the scheme of things. And that's simply because we've removed that tab system in there. That's something you'll have to deal with when we get to the sliders, which we'll jump on here very shortly. Uh, the rail, the joiners, whether they're the original slider types or the ones we're going to get into, rail clamps, are really the glue, if you will, that makes the track system work and operate not only short term, but more importantly, long term. And what you're quickly going to find out is that the standard slider type of rail joint that comes with your starter sets do not work over the long haul. Okay. Even though you might find used track out there that's pretty cruddy, it looks like it's been outdoor. If you take your starter set out and you put your track circle up and start working with it, over time, the train will eventually stop, even if you clean the top of the rail off, because that joiner will get oxidation inside it, someplace that you can't get to, because the rain, which causes the oxidation, gets in between the slip joint rail, the slip joiner, and the rail itself, and ultimately causes the same electrical discontinuity that the rail between your wheels do.
Yeah. Now,
So,
I'm only a couple of years into, the oxidation issues, and I use some of the antioxidant grease
yes,
in between,
that
and
will help you immensely.
yeah, it seems to have helped quite a few years. And I
This stuff.
yeah,
Right
oh, hey, how convenient. It was not planned.
You will love this stuff to solve that problem.
Yep.
Your wife will hate you for it because this stuff will get into everything,
Yeah.
your clothing and everything else. It's great stuff, by the way. It's great stuff.
Yeah.
It's actually electrically conductive grease.
Yep.
And
Hey, Jed or Bill, just real quick. So, Jed, are you saying that you had the clamps on there and then you started getting connectivity issues and you added the gel, or?
Oh, yeah. To
Yes.
be clear, you have to put it on before it oxidizes
Okay.
to get it to properly work.
Well, here's the catch to that whole thing. Okay, so here's a paintbrush, by the way. How do you get the gel in there or the grease in there without really gumming everything up? I typically use a small paintbrush. You get right inside the flange way here, and get that all painted up, and you can even do the other rail on the other piece of track before you put it together. Well, that's all great, but keep in mind what you're doing. You're only solving the conductivity problem on one half of the rail joint. That piece of rail joint that's still already connected to the rail and has the flange there, you can't pull this out. It will not come out unless you almost literally destroy the rail joint.
Yep.
Does not have any of that grease in it, and that grease won't get in it because you haven't painted it that way. So you will solve half of your problem, not all the problem. So what'll happen between 3 and 5 years, you will start getting electrical conductivity problems that simply will not go away.
Yeah.
Because that oxidation has occurred inside those clamps.
Which brings us to our next topic.
Yes.
Aftermarket
rail joiners. Yes. Well, real quick, a point I did want to make sure of. Understand that the rail joiners perform not only the connection function as a basic issue. Their main function is to keep the track aligned so that you have a continuous rail section. You provide then the electrical continuity between one section and another section, as well as it holds. I already mentioned it holds the rail in place from sliding, and then last but not least is it actually provides support. You can here's 2 feet of track, and obviously that track is pretty stable and still level. We still don't recommend you do want to support your track. Normally you do it with ballast, but there's times where people run trestles up and everything in blocks, and the track itself is the only structural element.
Yeah, so no 4-foot
you don't want to really
bridges.
do that beyond a rail joint because that's a weak point in the connections.
Yeah, no 4-foot bridge is only supported on the end.
In all fairness, I mean it's pretty tough. It's pretty rugged starting off.
Yeah.
But I don't recommend you stepping on it or anything, or getting a real heavy engine on it in the scheme of things. But those are the functions that the standard rail joiners, as well as the ones we're going to bring up, the rail clamps, perform in the scheme of things. I do want to make a comment for a few folks out there. There is, I know, both USA as well as Aristocraft produced a slider. Same looks the same. It's slightly different. It had a little hole in the side to let the track expand and contract. And lo and behold, there's a screw in there on the existing rail. Let's see that. I'll make it up here with the camera.
We have
along with that, underneath the track, they glued in some additional screws for you to take out. So when the next rail section of their type came along, you had the ability to take that screw out and screw those two rail sections together, because the other rail also had a hole in it drilled, pre-done by the manufacturers. Well, the insanity of all that is it takes if you're outside.
Oh yeah, those
and
little
you get these
screws.
little teeny tiny screws, which are typically stainless, therefore not magnetic. If they didn't line up exactly where they were, it was insane. I mean, people just went absolutely mad, and typically just never used them that well. But they were provided, and they are a much more rigid way of keeping the track together and electrically conductive.
Yeah.
So I can't knock success. It did work better.
Yeah, we got a quick question from Andrew. Do you connect power using your rail clamps, or do you solder the wires to the rail?
I have always been successful in utilizing the rail clamps as the power connection point.
Yeah.
Why? Because you got a very good screw element here that allows the wire. Now, I usually use eyelets, which you can get, that clamps the ends of the wire before it connects into the rail. This is obviously number 12 copper, which, by the way, I recommend.
Oh, that large.
Conductive. Yeah. The stuff that you get with a starter set, once you get from the starter set and go outside and start building a real railroad, take this stuff and I don't want to say throw it away, but either give it away or sell it to someone else, because it is useless. It's 24 gauge wire. Introduce both voltage drop, and you just simply won't keep the enough current available in the track. The rail is fine. This stuff, as I say, is like a number 6 copper conductor. I mean, this stuff would hold tremendous amounts of amperage.
Yeah. Hook your welder up to it.
It's always the rail joints and the wire connections that are the loose ends in the long-term success of the railroad.
And of course, put plenty of the conductivity grease on there.
And I won't discount the ability to either directly to the rail or at the rail clamp, on the side of the rail or on the bottom side of the rail, actually soldering your hardwire copper connection to the track to form a definite bond. That is another way that a lot of the folks have started with the rail joiners, the standard rail joiners, and didn't want to face, after a couple hundred feet of the track out there in a fixed layout, the last thing they wanted to consider is the necessity of taking it all apart and putting rail clamps on.
Yeah.
And therefore the ability to come out, clean off the brass to get it shiny, and solder a wire jumper across the old rail joint is certainly there. Now, it's not very prototypical looking, but hey, mother's necessity of need here. And it is the means by which you can maintain continuity in the rail. So it's still fair game there as a solution.
Bill, we may have to have another session on that, because I'm still using the Pico starter set wire that you just said to give to a friend. So
okay, we'll talk.
We need to know more about that.
Want to move on here before we get too far behind?
Yeah, one more question here from Bill Fedek, or I'm sorry, Boston Fedek. Question for Bill: what is his opinion on using copper anti-seize vice the LGB conductive grease on rail joints?
Yeah, we're back to this product here. Yeah, this is the best liquid. Well, it's a paste product I've come across. Pico offers it also. USA Trains offers it. It's basically the same material from the same suppliers.
Oh, yeah.
There's also a standard electrical product that is meant for the use of aluminum and copper intermix. It's called No-Ox that you can get at Home Depot, Lowe's. It works the very same way, and it's just as messy, and it gets all over your clothes and hands the same way. It will also work.
Yeah. So using anything is better than nothing.
Yeah. And starting out, that's a way to. It takes you a little bit longer time to get going, but at least it pays dividends. My rail's been out almost 30 years now, and I use standard brass rail clamps, and grease at those connection points, and still it's proven itself over all that time. I've only had to replace maybe a half dozen rail clamps, and those actually broke because of freeze thaw. Okay.
Hey, Bill. Hey, before you move on, just one last tip that I picked up on the Large Scale Consolidated YouTube channel with Mr. Pictovid, and you were talking about those little screws. I had some experience with those this past summer. as I'm trying to join my track. And those things are so tiny. And like you said, if you don't line them up, they fall in the dirt.
Yeah.
I couldn't find them. But on the last large scale consolidated, they had Jonathan the Fish guy, and he talked about putting a plate underneath the track as you're trying to like join it together. So that way, when that screw falls, it falls on that nice plate. So you have it. So I thought that was genius. I was like, I wish someone would have told me that.
There's probably a clue as to how successful when you have hundreds and hundreds of those, if you have plenty of time on your hands, go for it. I won't dissuade you from doing that if you choose not to. I highly recommend a pair of gloves because your knuckles will get mighty ripped up there with the ballast and everything else in the ground.
Yeah.
The way that the manufacturer, everybody has ultimately solved the problem of conductivity, as well as the rigidity and keeping the rails together and all the other points we've already made, is the use of an item called a rail clamp. Now, these are separate aftermarket products. I think Pico right now is one of the only the direct manufacturers that do, in their parts category, offer rail clamps for your use as an aftermarket issue. They offer it both to be placed over the original rail clamp, rail joiner, as well as your need to come out and take the old one off and put the new rail clamp right onto the rail.
Do you have a tip for removing those?
Well, the only real
originals?
suggestion is these puppies right here, a pair of needle nose pliers, and understand once you start in on them, the old rail joint is gone. You have to.
Oh yeah, I know you wiggle
bend
them
it both ways and then bend it down. And by
Yep.
the time you're done, it's totally shot.
Right. Yeah, right.
So that's just old used pieces of brass at that point.
Okay, I was just curious because
there's no way to salvage those. I've found.
Yeah, just send it to the recycler.
Hey Bill, can't you just pop? Are you able to pop the corner of the plastic piece off? I'm not explaining that real well. Where the rail joiner is. Yep, I'm pointing on my screen, which you can't see it. Are you able to just kind of peel that down and pop it out? Yeah.
Right here.
Then,
but
pull the brass part out.
To widen this portion of the rail joint to miss the bottom
raise it up a little
flange
bit.
of the rail.
Raise it up a little bit. You're out of screen.
Yeah. Okay. So you're going to miss. You're going to bend this, and when you bend that rail joint to miss the bottom wider portion of the rail itself, it's caught because you've lost your mechanical advantage on the top of the rail.
Okay.
I won't say that you cannot salvage them and get back with a big pair of pliers and bend them all back where you belong, but in the long run, it's a real hassle. I've not been very successful dealing with it.
Yeah, I knew Bob Duggan would comment here. David Hawks is a guy who makes some rail clamps currently. I knew he has been in contact with Bob, so maybe we can get in touch with David here in the near future since Splitjaw is gone away. So maybe there are some other options that are out there still.
Yeah, I did a quick. First off, let's get to the point. Okay, these are the proverbial rail clamps, and they consist of 5 parts: 2 screws, stainless steel, typically in every case, because there's a lot of pressure being placed on them by screwing them together. A solid piece, the gaps both rails, and then 2 small independent.
Right.
2 small independent pieces that all come together into a common rail clamp that hold the rail together and are flexible enough to allow the little bit of expansion and contraction that are necessary. And I got to give it credit. I mean, these screws, these stainless steel screws, you can get out there and crank these puppies down to the point where they squeak. And that's typically what they recommended. You tighten them to the point where they squeak on the rail. And at that juncture, here's a piece of stainless rail with a rail clamp in it. There is no, this connection is stronger than the rail itself. It will not bend, it will not break, and you can literally hang yourself on it as a clamping mechanism.
Sure.
So once you do that, you have recreated a continuous rail section all along the track. Now, still recommend this grease in there to keep the moisture and the water out, which is the means by which it oxidizes. I got 30 years on the majority of mine. That's all I got another 10 years out of the deal, and this is someone else's problem. So there's the advice as part of this clinic here. The nothing prevents. Well, I want to finish up the rail joints as to what the options are. Okay, where am I? Can you go back to this camera up here?
Oh, yeah.
Because of this business. There's our rail joint. I just took all apart here. Now, of course, we get the small one. There's all 5 parts, and all of these are similar to that. But there's a couple variations on the rail clamps. As I mentioned, the standard is intended to be connected directly to the rail, one rail to the other. And it's intended to be clean at the beginning. If not, you got to sit there and clean the rail. And the rail clamps, highly recommend starting with new rail clamps because otherwise you got to clean them too. The 2 materials these typically are made out of are brass, solid bullets of brass, and solid stainless steel. Mm-hmm. You can intermix these 2 between brass rail and stainless rail and not incur any kind of cathodic problem, essentially.
Oh, okay. So no galvanic corrosion.
And I guess because I go back to our aluminum rail and even the nickel silver. The nickel silver does not. The only thing you can use on nickel silver is the stainless. Do not use the brass because you set up a cathodic.
Right, and you wouldn't want to use aluminum.
And actually, it actually eats away at the metal.
Yeah.
It once it has water on it. The aluminum rail is a total disaster if you use any of those rail clamps.
Yeah, stainless steel with
brass does not work. Even though stainless is pretty inert, it's still a dissimilar metal, and the aluminum itself still.
You'll get that white flaky corrosion.
Yeah. The only thing that really is offered for the aluminum rail because of its inexpensive nature is simply the slider type rail clamps in aluminum. And again, it's only intended to keep the rails aligned is pretty much it. Yeah. Because the assumption is you're not using it for power purposes. Back to our rail clamps.
Yeah.
Okay, some variations on the theme. I mentioned the over the rail clamp version, which is offered, which was a way to solve the problem of reestablishing continuity on existing railroads that were out there and weren't working. And yes, I will agree that you can buy these, which are bigger and thicker and cost a little bit more, and they will go over top of your existing rail clamps, and you can tighten them down. And by George, they'll reestablish because they're mechanically pinching that whole shebang together. Yeah. But but once again, the same problem, just like you couldn't put the grease in the backside to cover, happens again, and eventually they will still fail.
Yeah.
So in the end, if you're going to go to the expense, because these are expensive, these are rough. The stainless steel ones were priced at $2.50 a piece. The brass ones were priced at $2 a piece. So you've bought a piece of track that's already $6.50 if you're talking the brass. Now you're going to buy another $5 worth of rail clamps to hold the whole shebang together, which all points to the fact of why you should look at the flexible rail that's 6 foot or 8 foot long, simply because you have far fewer rail joints and therefore far less cost, no matter which rail clamp you use in the process.
What's the longest piece of rail that you can buy on the market? 12 feet, 14 feet?
No, well, you can special order stuff, but UPS defined the maximum at 8 foot.
Oh, okay.
None of the manufacturers could ship anything longer than 8 feet without special. I mean, you could do LCL carriage, but to use UPS and all the standard.
I assume the manufacturing would be extrusion, where they would just.
Well, this stuff was rolled. Most all this stuff was rolled out to do the standard rail cross section, and the limit. Aristo sold 8 footers. USA sold 8 footers for a while. AccuCraft, who's the latest entry into the market. Oh, I didn't mention that earlier. Because we're talking about rail, I'm going to back up a minute. It's in fairness to those manufacturers, at least I get grief off of them. Okay. all these things we started talking about are starter set stuff from the major 4 manufacturers.
Yeah.
But in fairness, once you get away from the standard sectional stuff on the starter sets and get into this bigger stuff, then the field opens up to multiple 6 additional manufacturers: AccuCraft, Proline, Micro Engineering out of St. Louis, Yagas Creek out in California, Sunset Valley up in Oregon, are other major track manufacturers. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, this piece here is exactly this is Sunset Valley, both their ties and rail, which is more prototypical, which I've used in a couple of installations. So all that is out there. They offer ties and rail, and rail, either rail joiners or rail clamps in the scheme of things. But they don't manufacture starter sets, and they don't. A lot of them, AccuCraft does, but the rest of them are basically just all rail suppliers.
Okay.
They manufacture it and supply it out there, and it's all available.
Okay.
Okay. So now we get back to our point. The other variations on the theme, beyond the fact of brass and stainless steel, is, well, what happens if you're if you need discontinuity in the rail for purposes of signaling, or if you're still dealing with the old analog, and I'm using terms that we haven't defined. The original starter sets are considered analog. You simply vary the voltage up and down to vary the speed of the engine, and you flip the polarity to change the direction from forward to reverse.
Sure.
We conventionally refer to that as analog.
Yeah.
Beyond that, it gets much more complicated. Most of the indoor fellows are familiar with DCC, digital command control. We're going to stick with analog for a while here, okay?
Yeah, we're just
trying to get the trains to run. We're just trying to get the
level.
trains to run as they came out of the box, okay?
Yeah.
If you have need for splitting the rail and not maintaining continuity, and that occurs if you produce what was called a reverse loop, where the track starts, goes through a switch, and comes back on itself. You create a direct short in the typical analog power, and you have to provide an insulated rail joint, and that's what these do. And these are simply. We're up here now. Okay.
Oh, which one do you want to go in? The yeah,
we'll do this.
There we go.
All right. So these are a standard. Half of it is brass for the content and for the structural integrity. And the other half is a hard rubberized plastic, and that provides the insulating capability. The brass, even though they're next to one another, are separated just enough that they break the power between the two. And so that's how that issue is answered. The other last piece to the puzzle here, I'll point out, because I found the need to put together outdoor railroads for display purposes that would stay up maybe 6 months. And once again, the standard slip joint rail joiners didn't want to rely on them. Well, Aristo and a few other manufacturers offer, and you still find them, a rail clamp that you actually attach from above with a standard Phillips screwdriver.
Yeah.
They absolutely do not look prototypical, but hey, again, you're after something that's temporary and set up quickly and be taken apart quickly and still operate over that longer period. And that's what these units are.
Oh yeah. Okay. Do they only make those? Well, those Phillip heads look pretty good.
Yeah. They're standard Phillips head screwdriver.
Yeah.
Now you can tighten them down too far and snap the screw.
Yeah, the screw head is going to be the weak point there.
Yeah. Okay, so I digress in the sense that we move on, because again, they perform the same function. None of these rail clamps are prototypical, but neither are the slider rail joints in the scheme of things. And that's just the way they are, because you're dealing with a much smaller piece of material with still the need for maintaining continuity.
Yeah.
And as a result, Mother Nature, the looks take a second seat
Mhm.
to the functionality of the whole process. Okay. Let's remove that over here. Talked about our costs, so we're still good. We got $250 for the stainless on the rail clamps and roughly $2 a piece for the brass. If you're using brass rail, use brass rail clamps. If you're using stainless steel rail, use stainless steel clamps. You can use the stainless on the brass and vice versa, but why pay another 50 cents for something that's not going to pay dividends?
Right. Now, God forbid, what if you had to connect a piece of brass track to stainless steel track? How would you make that jump, or would you just never recommend doing that?
Oh yeah, you can do that. I would still stick with the stainless. The stainless is pretty impervious. It does not degrade anywhere as fast as the brass.
Okay.
So if all else fails, always stick with the stainless.
Yeah. The I have found with the Pico rail clamps that the threads and the Allen drive on it are quite small, and they tend to strip a little easier if you're not careful, compared to split jaws and some of the other brands. They're a little less beefy, in my opinion.
I would agree with you. I've talked to Jonathan and them about that issue.
Yeah.
If you're on, let's see. There's the particular type of rail joint he's referring to. If I can get it out, yeah, there we go. And the only difference is they provide a smaller set of screws, and because of that, they tend to you can over torque them and break them easy.
Oh, very, very easily.
Yeah.
And you don't need to be Superman tightening those down.
So again, another issue out there. Each of the manufacturers are slightly different, and typically you try to stick with one brand over another once you get used to it.
Yeah.
All of them, we try to use the, you can use an Allen wrench if you care to scuff up your knuckles in short order. You can buy, as part of this, all the manufacturers offer these little screwdriver type of drivers that I highly recommend, because you can jump between one. You can actually connect one rail joint
From
across the
underneath,
track
yeah.
to the other if you choose to.
Yeah. What's the size of that? It's
3/16. It's a 3/16 hex wrench.
Oh, is it that big? I thought
Yeah,
the split
they're-
jaws were smaller than that, like 7/64ths.
They're,
or
they're,
something.
they fit right in there.
Yeah.
in the scheme of things.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
should be right. Yeah. The that really gets us into a few. We wanted to touch base tonight before we finish up on some, what I consider some, not all, design basics with regard to the track. Seems how it's the crux of everything we're doing here. To give you a few things to ponder between now and next meeting. Number one, as far as a series of recommendations, back to our radius issue. Again, you get a 2-foot radius, 4-foot diameter track with the starter sets. It will run the little tiny engines that come with the starter sets, but if you quickly want to get into the larger scale equipment like SD40s and Mac 70s and all those big engines, then I highly recommend you getting out from underneath the smaller radius track when you do a larger scale plan. And the best I can recommend there is the larger the radius, the larger the trains that you can run on them, and the better the trains will run over the long haul. You can run longer trains with larger radiuses. Simply put, the real railroads have to approach it that way, and even in this smaller scale, it works that way here too.
Yeah, I made the mistake. The piece of rail that's just to your right there that I handed to you, that has a sharper than a 2-foot radius or 4-foot diameter curve, and I was having constant derailment issues right in the middle of that point. Maybe not all the time, but
you can see
it was just a little too sharp. And I use 2-axle short LGB cars, and they were still having issues. So if you bent your own rail, which is what I did with that, I bent it to make it fit in an area, but I was a little too optimistic.
Yeah, I had a similar situation where I started with a Pico starter set, and I was so excited because I got additional cars that were used, but I had no idea about turn radius and 4 foot and 6 and 8 and larger. So yeah, just like Jed said, I kept getting derailments, and it was kind of disheartening, because you want to make your train longer and you have new cars, but
Yeah.
it just wasn't meant for the 4 foot.
Yeah.
The sharper the radius, and particularly if you get a long set of cars, there's a lot of pressure on the cars to literally flop over uh, in the business of the engine pulling them. So once again, the larger the radius, the better the train's track. Simply put, the minimum radius that we've all talked about is the 2 foot, 4 foot diameter, 2 foot radius, 4 foot diameter. Quite frankly, I recommend as a minimum a 4 foot radius, 8 foot diameter. If you do that, even though you don't know where you're going before you get there, as far as buying equipment and running things, right now, an 8 foot diameter, 4 foot radius will run just 95, 90 to 95% of all the equipment that's available out there for you to purchase, whether it's any of those scales that we've talked about tonight, from 1/32 all the way up to 7/8. So, something to ponder. Now, that means that, it's an 8 foot diameter. It starts taking up a lot of territory, more territory than maybe you had anticipated. But in the long run, that'll be to your benefit. So we'll leave you with that thought on that topic.
Yeah, and Andrew mentioned here that LGB did design just about all of their engines and cars so they would run on a 4 foot.
I won't disagree with that at all. I agree with that fully. The problem is the way they look. When you take a 24 plus 26-inch passenger car and put it on a 2 foot radius, the middle of the car hangs beyond the rail limit.
Yeah.
In some cases. So it will definitely functionally, mechanically work, but it looks truly a little out of scale.
Yeah.
The next item is track grade. The up and down of things. Let's see it. Oh, it's back here.
Okay.
Quick recommendation. Normally, you try to go out, and when you start out, you try to maintain the track flat on the ground. But the ground doesn't cooperate with you, and you find your way running from one end of the yard to the other, up and down. If you go out with a level and check the ground, very little ground is ever absolutely level. And even though you may think it's flat, it isn't, and therefore it induces a grade. So the train slows down going one direction and speeds up going the other, coming back. And that's because the ground is uneven. The standard rule of thumb on this, make a note, do not exceed a 3% grade. Now, what the heck does that mean? That means do not put your track in that allows for a 3 inch and 100 inches worth of variation of difference between the high and the low portion. Now, that's an odd kind of dimension, so I always go back to a good old 3 foot ruler. Look at a ruler and take that whole thing and divide it by 1/3. That means within the 3 foot dimension of your ruler, you cannot have the track go either up or down more than 1 inch. Now, inside the room on a table like this, that may sound nifty to do and easy to accomplish, but when you take that whole concept and go outdoors with it, you'll quickly find out that Mother Nature is going to fight you on that. And therefore, you're going to be faced with the same problem the real railroads are. You will either have to put fill in or you'll have to dig out some of the ground to allow the track to pass by. Yeah. If you're going to either minimize your grade, or even if the extreme is to actually try to go out and produce a flat track sometimes. But obviously, if you want to run trains up and over themselves, like in an elevated crossing, then here's our next recommendation on that process. And I'm going to have to preface it a little bit. We're going to assume that you're once again dealing in this scale 1 to 22.5. We're not talking the smaller scales, and we're not talking the bigger scale. And if you do it that way, then you want to have no more than those tracks crossing over one another don't want to cross over one another less than 12 inches from the high to low. And why that? Because you're going to have a roadbed in between there, or a bridge or some other structure. And therefore, with one track down below, one track up in the air, you want to shoot for that as a guide. You want to keep those that far separated. If you do, you'll be okay. When you accomplish that, you'll wind up, though, to go out and back to cover that kind of distance and maintain that 3% grade we just spoke about will take about 36 feet of track. Once again, start chewing up territory.
Yeah.
Will the trains run on something shorter and closer together? Yes, they will.
Yeah, I've proven that on mine.
But again, we're trying to get you started in that category. And if you have to compromise, then you'll be okay.
Yeah, it's definitely something we can pick up on our episode 2 of all of this. And I know we're probably running a little bit long. I'm seeing some comments here of the length of our show. It's last time we tried to stick to about an hour, and we got comments it was too short. So we said, well, we'll just let it go this time. But I do appreciate, Bill, you coming out and bringing all of this equipment with you. And it's you're just a wealth of knowledge, and you've had so many experiences building commercial layouts and other private layouts that you've kind of seen it all. So it's great to have. And so really, David, do you have any other final comments?
No, Jed, I was just going to echo what you said. I really appreciate Bill putting this on, because again, as the new person, you watch a lot of YouTube videos and they show you all kinds of extravagant things. They show all kinds of layouts, but just the basics are never covered. So just the fact that, Bill dedicated this time to cover the basics about track, is very helpful to us beginners. And I'm sure other people that have been experienced, they probably learned some things too. So thanks, Bill.
Yeah. All right. Well, only one thing left to do in our show here, folks, and that is let's go outside and run some trains. Now, tonight's footage is coming to us from Tim Dove over at the Forest Park Garden Railroad. And we had a little bit of snow this week, and he owns a snowplow. So this is some great stuff. Enjoy our outtakes, and thank you for joining us tonight. We'll see you in 2 weeks for our next show, okay?
All right.
Merry Christmas.
Bye, everybody.
Happy New Year's.
See ya.